Alright, so let's go over problem 2621, sleep in JavaScript today. So, the problem states, given an integer millis, write an asynchronous function that sleeps for milliseconds. It can resolve any value. So, what does this mean? All it's saying is we're going to be given a positive integer called millis, and this positive integer is going to go into our asynchronous function and sleep for that amount of time before we resolve. So, for example, if I was to give 100 into millis, our asynchronous function is going to sleep for 100 milliseconds, and then we will resolve with a value. So, let me just show you the flow a little bit better with example 1 right here, but I'll explain it over here at the right. So, we have this asynchronous function, and it's called sleep, and it's going to be receiving our milliseconds. Now, down here, it's just showing you an example of a flow. So if we take the current value that it is when we first start running our program, we're going to store that value into t. So next, we're going to call this sleep function, and we're going to throw in 100 milliseconds into the function. So this asynchronous function is going to somehow hold on to that value and sleep for 100 milliseconds and then resolve, which is what we're going to be adding into the space here. But once that resolves after 100 milliseconds, we will catch it, and then we'll console log the current value it is now since we've resolved versus the time when we first sent 100 milliseconds in. And if our program took 100 milliseconds to resolve, it should return 100 since it's the current value of right now after it resolved minus the value we first sent our 100 in. So it should be the difference. Don't worry if you don't understand all that yet, because I'll be going over the theory in this, as this problem is going to be using a lot of different concepts in asynchronous programming and theories in that. So I'll go ahead and talk about that now. Alright, so I'm going to do my best to explain some of the theory behind this. Do note that asynchronous programming, or just these concepts, kind of get in depth, and there's a lot you can learn from it, but I'm just going to go over what I think you need to know for this problem. So, starting off, what is asynchronous programming? Well, asynchronous programming, all it is allows us to multitask. So, in regular synchronous programming, you execute function by function by function. So if one function is up at the top, you have to wait for that one to finish before you're going to move on to the next one. The thing with asynchronous programming, you can multitask. So if you have that top function as an asynchronous function, well, when you go on that function, if it's going to take some time to complete, you can go ahead and start executing the other functions while you're waiting on that function. So it essentially allows you to multitask. And this is really good to have an asynchronous function when we're doing something like fetching data, because oftentimes when you fetch data, that's going to take a few seconds. And if you were using synchronous program, you would have to wait those few seconds before anything else in your program would run. Whereas if you're using an asynchronous function, you can multitask while that's going. And this is just the syntax for that. So just async, and then function, and then the name of your function, and then whatever you want to happen in that function. And there's some other things that we can pair up with asynchronous functions. Alright, so let's talk about the setTimeout function. Now this is just a built-in JavaScript function that lets us set a timer to a function. So the syntax of this looks like this. We'll just do setTimeout, and then we'll have a function that we want to set a delay to, and the amount of time that delay is going to be. So for example, I could have a function that console logs hello, and I could put that function here, and for the delay, maybe I want to do 5 seconds. So once we hit this point in our code, it's going to count to 5, and then it's going to console log hello, or just execute this function after X amount of time that we put into the delay. So that's the setTimeout function. I was going to talk about the await keyword, but it's not really relevant to the problem we'll be solving, but maybe that's something you want to look into. Alright, so moving along, let's talk about promises in JavaScript. So all promises is a built-in JavaScript object that lets us see whether an asynchronous operation has failed or succeeded. So we can actually use a promise with the setTimeout function since we're waiting on an asynchronous operation. We're waiting on this function to be executed. We're waiting on that. So we could use a promise with the setTimeout. So we're just using that to see if the asynchronous operation has failed or succeeded. That's all we're doing. And inside of a promise, we're going to have 3 different states. So those states can be pending, fulfilled, or rejected. Pending is just the initial state. So it's when we're waiting on our asynchronous operation to complete. So if we're delayed by 5 seconds, it's in that initial state. But if that asynchronous operation has succeeded and everything went right, our state will be fulfilled. If it went bad, it went wrong, we're going to get a rejected state. So that is kind of what a promise is. It can get a little bit more in depth than that, but I think this will cover it on how we need to solve our problem. Now I'll walk you through this example. Now, this example is just going to apply the concepts we talked about and just show you how it all works. So we've created this asynchronous function here, which there should be async here, but I just forgot to put it. But we have this function here called fetch data from a server, and what it's going to do is simulate us fetching data from a server. It's not actually doing that, but it's simulating it. So what we've done is created this promise that we'll be returning in this function, and this is the syntax of a promise, so get a good look at that and how it works. What we do is we're going to either return a resolve or reject, and these are going to hold data. Now, we determine whether to return a resolve or reject due to its promise state. So if our asynchronous operation was fulfilled, everything went right, we'll return the resolve. If it went bad, if we failed, we will return the reject. So with that, inside of our promise, we're going to do our setTimeout, which the setTimeout is just, we know that it takes in a function and we can set a delay to it. So we're defining the actual function in here instead of outside, and then we have a delay here. So our delay is 1,000 milliseconds, or just 1 second, and once that happens, we'll do everything inside of here. Now, what we're doing in here is we're applying a variable called success, and all the success is doing is going to either hold true or false, and it holds true 80% of the time because math.random is going to generate a number between 0 and 1, I believe it is, and we're saying that is less than 0.8. So that is going to be true 80% of the time. Now, under that, we're going to test to see if that value was true or false. If it was true, what we're going to do is we're just going to store this object inside a fetch data variable, and we will resolve our promise and return that fetch data inside of our resolve. Now, if this success was false, what we'll do is we'll put this failed to fetch data inside of this error message, and we'll reject with that error message. So this error message is going into reject, and that promise will return this reject. Now, outside of this, let's go ahead and see how we call this function. So we call the function, so fetch data from the server, and then what's going to happen is it's going to be delayed by 1 second, and then we're going to actually begin. So it's going to begin doing this in here, and it's going to either resolve or it's going to reject. Now, for say if it resolves, we call the .then. .then is going to catch this fetch data, this object, inside of the data here, because this is one parameter, and then we're going to console log the fetch data, and then we're just going to log that object. Now, in order to catch the reject, what we do is we do .catch, and that's going to catch the reject. And we know that the reject had this error message. The error message is going to go into this error parameter, and we're just going to console log error, and then whatever that error message said. So that's kind of how these concepts are applied. So hopefully that clears it up. Don't worry if you don't completely understand it. It may take a little bit of time and some research on your own and just practice to fully grasp it. But I think this sets you with a solid foundation to solve this problem. Alright, so let's go ahead and solve this. So we have this asynchronous function here that is going to be receiving a argument that goes into this millis parameter, and whatever value we send into this millis, we're going to delay this asynchronous function by that amount of time. So what we have to do is create the code in here that is going to actually delay this function. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to do return new promise. So we created our promise, and we know a promise can either resolve or it can reject. But in this case, we're never going to be rejecting. We're just waiting for a resolve, as it's just a timer. We're not really fetching data. We're just setting a timer, and we just need this to resolve. So we can completely get rid of reject in this case. Now from here, we can go ahead and make our asynchronous operation. So let's think. We need this resolve to be delayed. Now, what is a built-in JavaScript function that can cause a function to be delayed? Well, we can use the setTimeout function to cause that. So this setTimeout function is going to receive a function, and it's going to take in a delay. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, setTimeout, what we're wanting to actually execute is our resolve. So we can just use the keyword resolve, and when this is called upon, our promise will be fulfilled and everything's resolved. Now, how long do we want to wait till we call this resolve? Well, we want to wait by whatever time we send into here. So we can just use that millis parameter, and now whenever we send a value into millis, we're going to wait that long, and then we're going to resolve our promise and return that promise. So let's go ahead and run this and see. Alright, so cool. Both cases worked the way they should have. Let's go ahead and submit this. Alright, cool. It works. Runtime memory's not really great here. It may have just been the time I ran it. Let me submit that again, see if we get anything better. Alright, so yeah, that's a whole lot better, but it's going to be different every time, but that's how you solve this problem. So yeah, we could have also used await here, and what await would do is it's going to allow other asynchronous operations to take place while we're waiting on our promise to be resolved, whereas if we use return, it's just going to directly return this promise. And with return, we can actually control some other things with that, with the .then, kind of like how I was doing in the previous example. We can catch that, and we can maybe console log something once the promise is caught by using a return. And I'll go ahead and just show you that. Alright, so let me just explain the difference in using return and await here. So by using return, we are directly returning this promise. So I've went ahead and created this variable down here called sleep promise, and all it's doing is calling this asynchronous function, and it's sending 1,000 milliseconds into this parameter here, or just 1 second, and that delays this promise by a second, and then we directly return this promise into this sleep promise variable. Now down here we're calling sleep promise, and we're saying hey .then. Now .then is grabbing the resolve, so if we resolved or not. In this case, we did resolve, and we're always going to resolve because we're not rejecting. Well, once it catches the resolve, we're going to console log delay finished. So that's kind of what return is doing here. It allows us to catch the resolve or the reject and then do something with that data by returning the promise directly. Now, if we were to use, for say, await here, this code right here won't work. The reason for that is we're not returning anything. We're not directly having access to this promise. Instead, what await returns by default is undefined, as this asynchronous function is going to wait on this promise to resolve, and then once it does resolve, await is just, or we're just rather going to return undefined because we're not given a value to return. Now, the power of using await here is that it's going to allow other asynchronous operations to take place, and that's really useful because while we're waiting on this promise to resolve, those other operations can be taking place and we're not waiting on this one. We're not having to go step by step. We can multitask. So it's really powerful. So hopefully that clears up the difference in using return and await here. But if you have any questions at all, leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to get back with you. And yeah, let me know what type of problem you want me to solve next. And if you enjoy this video, appreciate a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.